Hello, people of the internet, and welcome to the next episode of our retrospective look on the history of Godzilla in animation. I'm your host, Andres Perez, aka Kaiju Noir, and here with me is my co-host, Mr. Matt Denian.
Hey everybody, good to see you guys again.
And so for
Or
this,
not see.
it's all right. I'm pretty sure that people will get a kick out of this series. After all, I feel like there's not a lot of people who put a lot of focus on Godzilla in animation. They mostly look at the movies, and if they do talk about animation, it's usually been the American side. With the Hanna-Barbera series and the subject of today's video, which is Godzilla, the series, which is a spin-off / follow-up to the 1998 American adaptation of The King of the Monsters. It aired on Fox Kids from September 12th, 1998 to April 22nd of 2000. It ran for 2 seasons with a total of 40 episodes, only 38 of which were aired. And this was actually a series that I have a lot of nostalgia for, having grown up with it, watching it every Saturday morning, back on when Saturday morning cartoons used to be a thing back in the day. Now, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, yeah, me too. I'm a little bit older than you, but I definitely still got up to make sure I watch this on Saturday mornings. Sometimes Saturday night if I recorded it on VHS back then. That's how we rolled.
Oh, yeah, I remember. We used to, in case you were very busy on a Saturday morning, you would actually have to record it. But unlike these kids today, where they could just record it into their DVR or TiVo, or, if those things still exist, we would actually have to put in a VHS tape and then record it so that it would permanently stay on the VHS tape, unless, however, you were to record over it, at which point you could damage the quality of the VHS. Yeah. So, this was a very interesting product because there was a lot of hype. Growing up in in the late 90s, there was a lot of hype surrounding the Sony TriStar Columbian Pictures adaptation of Godzilla, and there's a lot of hype, there was a lot of marketing for it, and then as soon as everyone saw it, they were like, yeah, we're not going to fall for this again. And there were a lot of troubles and trials and tribulations that occurred, a lot of trouble for Sony and TriStar in the aftermath of Godzilla. And however, it did seem like they had a lot of plans for this series. They had the animated show, they had the toy line. They were planning on making this a trilogy of movies.
Right.
But after the after the disappointment, after a lot of people were pissed off at Godzilla 98, and a lot of theaters were upset because they weren't making as much money as they thought. On top of that, Sony and TriStar were taking a bigger cut of the profits from theater chains, more so than usual, which made the theaters had even less money. And then on top of that, the toy line didn't actually sell well, which led to Trendmasters actually canceling the toy line for this animated series, which sucks because I would have loved, as a kid, I would have loved to have had toys of a lot of these monsters. A lot of their plans for this franchise came tumbling down, and the only thing that ever came out of this in the aftermath of the movie was the animated series, which does remind me a lot of what happened to the Green Lantern movie, where that was a Warner Brothers movie that they had a lot of plans for, and unfortunately it didn't go as well, it didn't go as planned, and however, by the time they made the movie, they'd already had that Bruce Timm animated series, so they were like, well, this was a complete flop, but we already have this TV show ready to capitalize on our non-existent big hit, so might as well show them what we got so far. And so,
right.
Yeah, we ended up with Green Lantern, the animated series, for 1 season.
But that's an apt comparison because Godzilla 98 was financially successful for the most part. Like you said, it didn't put as much as they were hoping for.
Right.
But the fan backlash to it was tremendous at the time, because it definitely wasn't a Godzilla, yet they still went ahead and released this series the following fall to go with it. Right. And the series took a different approach than the movie did.
Right. And it kind of did everything that Dean Devlin and Roland Emmerich intentionally avoided, because they were not fans of Godzilla. They saw the monster versus monster stuff as very cheesy and something that adults wouldn't be able to take seriously, although looking at how successful Kong Skull Island and Godzilla 14 was, they can kiss my ass.
Yeah, damn right. They just were not in touch with their audience at that time. That's for sure, or the fan base. So
right. So it's very interesting that you have an animated series that was aimed towards kids. So it's really ironic that we have a thing that's aimed towards kids and does go with the monster versus monster action. And in the end, it ended up being generally liked by everyone who disliked the movie.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing when you consider it that the movie wasn't liked. They kept the same basic design for Godzilla in this series. Mm-hmm. Now, the big changes were, obviously, they put other monsters into the series for him to fight. But more importantly, I feel like it was the approaches to Godzilla himself that changed. So, for instance, Godzilla fans are used to Godzilla like not backing down from things and having that kind of fighting spirit, I've heard it referred to as. Mm-hmm. And this animated version of Godzilla definitely had that, which the live action one did not, where like in the 98 film, she ran away from everything. This monster was much more apt to take on another creature. They also reinstated the atomic breath for this, which was a nice addition that was not in the 98 film.
Yeah, and it was a very interesting artistic decision to make the atomic breath green in this instance. I guess because if you're thinking like radioactivity and radiation, green tends to be a color that comes up in your mind. So it was a kind of an interesting choice. And I think it over time I quickly grew to like how this version of the atomic breath was executed, especially when it's given more of like a flame-like texture to it, as opposed to beams of pure radiation like in the traditional Godzilla films. And it's almost kind of like, I was almost going to say it's like the 2015 version, but then I was thinking maybe that's more like a cloud of hot gas and smoke and mist.
I think you're right. I thought about it. I do think kind of like what we saw at the end of 2014, the beam is similar to that, much more so than comparable to, say, like the Heisei Godzilla beam, where it's a straight-up beam coming out. But either way, it was nice to see Godzilla have that ability back for this series, which we didn't get in the film.
Yeah. So. And also found it very interesting that the one major contribution that Dean Devlin and Roland Emmerich made to their Godzilla, which was the fact that it could reproduce asexually at a dangerous rate. They completely retconned that in this version by stating outright, this Godzilla is sterile.
Yeah, I think they kind of had to, and it worked out better that way, because we didn't want to see Godzilla become a threat in this series, or them to have like 1,000 Godzillas running around type of thing. Mm-hmm. So I think to make him unique and singular, that was the right move to make in this case.
Right. And as for the design itself, it's pretty much like the Godzilla design, although they made him a darker shade of almost dark, almost blackish, brownish color. They did give him a lighter underbelly. And however, the posture is like the one thing that they made a lot of the biggest change to his
yes.
physical design. A lot of times he's like more standing upright, and he's just he's striding, he's walking tall, walking proud, his chest out like that, like he's got a lot of confidence. And then other times when he's running, then he would take on that horizontal T-Rex stance that we saw in the movie.
Right, which I think helps to build his personality a little bit more. Like you said, he's walking tall, he's confident in certain scenes, or there are certain scenes too where he'd be kind of like a feline, like down on all fours when he's trying to interact with the people in the show. So that gave him a little bit more personality, which I think helped to endear this version of Godzilla a little bit more to the fan base than, again, comparing it to the 98 film, where there just wasn't much to him other than monster and a loose type of thing.
Mm-hmm. And I do like how they were able to execute this Godzilla's personality, where he, in this version of Godzilla, as shown throughout the initial 2 episodes, if you've seen the ending of Godzilla 98, you know that one of the eggs survive. And right. So in this kind of retconned ending, Nick Tatopoulos is there to witness the birth of Godzilla Jr. He is able to make a maternal bond mother-child bond with Nick Tatopoulos. Because
I think specifically what they go for is kind of imprinting. Like if a baby duck hatches, that's what they say.
That's the word I was looking for. Thank you very much. So Godzilla Jr. imprints on Nick because he happens to be wrapped up. Actually, he fell into like the same puddle of goo that was surrounding all of the eggs. And then like a couple days later, Godzilla Jr. grows up into adolescent form and eventually an adult form, and still retains that imprinting bond to Nick Tatopoulos, so he feels very compelled to follow Nick or protect him at all costs. So he forms a team which is known as HEAT, I believe, and so the what was it? What did HEAT stand for?
HEAT is Humanitarian Environmental Analysis Team.
Cool. And so he has the two characters from the movie, Elsie Chapman and Mendel Craven, two characters that were severely underused in the movie, and introduces two more characters with Randy Hernandez, who is an intern who works under Nick, and he's kind of someone that he is very close friends with. And he is more of a hacker, so he's more like the computer guy, whereas Craven's more like the tech guy. Elsie is the what would you...
She's a paleontologist.
Okay, yeah. So she's more like the paleontologist / biologist of the team, where it's like she's studying the behaviors of these animals. And then finally we have Monique Dupree. She is from the same French Secret Service agency that Philippe was from, and so Philippe sent her to keep an eye on Nick Tatopoulos, the HEAT team, and Godzilla to make sure Godzilla doesn't go out of control.
Right. And the other key to the series is that the radiation that caused this Godzilla, the 98 Godzilla, to form in the first place, is creating a bunch of other, or something else is creating a bunch of other mutants that are popping up all over the world.
Right. So, it is kind of interesting how one single series of French bombing, nuclear French bombings would end up creating monsters all over the world. I'm not sure how that works. Like with Godzilla, I can understand that. Not sure where the other monsters come from. They give like the vague hint that they're all mutations caused by nuclear testing, I guess, but it's never made clear. It's just these monsters just pop up out of nowhere and they're like, yep, we're here now, we're a thing.
Yeah, I do wish they would have gone into a little more depth about that. Like maybe there was some kind of environmental change going on or something that was causing giant mutants to be created or to come up from the center of the earth, or something that explained it a little bit more. But that being said, they came up with some pretty good designs for the monsters, like you said.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Before we get into the monsters, there was one more character, somewhat of a character I would bring up, which is Nigel, which is this robot that Craven created to act as sort of like a drone to go inspect areas and analyze areas that are too dangerous for the rest of the team. Nigel is an acronym for Next Millennium Intelligence Gathering Electronic Liaison, and he's
kind of like the Kenny from South Park of the show, where he's like smashed each episode and becomes like a gag that goes on, and he's also a nice comedy relief because Randy and Mendel have like this sort of rivalry going on, and Randy's constantly reprogramming Nigel to give him like his mother's voice. So
like a bunch of random voices. Like he'll talk like a cowboy in one episode. He'll talk like a New Yorker another episode. Another time he'll be quoting Shakespeare.
Right, I think he's the Three Stooges at one point, right?
yeah. And it's funny enough, like anytime he gets destroyed, he pulls off like this like Pee Wee Herman scream, like like Godzilla smacks his tail and go ah, and then gets destroyed. So yeah, that is a really amusing, funny running gag.
So about this team, because you mentioned it briefly, comparing it to like the Hanna-Barbera Godzilla team, I feel like this team is much more fleshed out and has more specific roles than we saw in previous Godzilla animation.
Oh yeah, definitely. Especially in the case of Nick Tatopoulos, who is a huge improvement over the version that we got in the live-action movie, where he was portrayed by why am I blanking on his name now?
Matthew Broderick.
Thank you
film?
very much, Matthew
Yes.
Broderick. The thing is, like, Matthew Broderick has like zero charisma,
Right.
zero personality in that movie. He just kind of is very passive aggressive. He talks in a very monotone voice. He kind of lets people walk all over him, and he never really does anything to make him the hero of the movie, even though that's what he's supposed to be. Instead, it's just other characters, other better, more interesting characters.
Right.
Like Major Hicks or Philippe, just like, grabbing him by the arm and taking him to where he needs to go.
Right. In this instance, in the animated series, he's much more of a leader. He's much more confident. He's voiced by Ian Ziering, who would, leave 90210 fame, and for most of our fan base probably know him from Sharknado fame at this point, right? So
I'm glad he was going places afterwards.
yeah. But he does a very good job as a voice actor. He does a few other things too, voice acting, but he does a good job in this of establishing Nick as a leader and a confident person and somebody who actually knows what he's doing, which you don't get from Matthew Broderick's character necessarily in the film.
Yeah, and he's like very viciously protective of Godzilla as well. Like he does he does grow to see Godzilla as like his responsibility, his child basically, like something that he has grown a genuine bond to.
Yeah, and then like you said, the other characters come across better too. Elsie, the redhead Chapman, who's only very briefly in the film, is a much more well-realized character in the animated series, where she's a strong character. She has her own opinions. She's still kind of flirtatious with Nick.
Oh yeah, she does do that, much to Craven's chagrin.
Right.
She's very sassy. She makes like some sarcastic quips here and there. She did do that a little bit in the movie, so I'm glad they were able to take that small piece and make it work here.
Right. And Craven, again, he's similar to like he was in the movie, but they do flesh him out a bit more to give him like more of a sense of humor with he and Randy having kind of that give and take between the two of them.
Yeah.
And they make him seem more competent, which they didn't really come across in the film as that.
All right. He just had one sneeze joke, like one like snot joke, and that was his entire contribution to that whole movie. He just stays in the background after that. And they did, funny enough, they do make a running gag of him having allergies every time, almost all the time. And he is very cowardly, very timid. He does have a bit of that back and forth with Randy, where it's like one's the more sticks to the books, the other is more like a loose loose cannon, a hothead. So it's like these two opposite personalities. The careful one and the more risk-taking one, like constantly clashing, and it's very charming looking at trying to see this relationship, like they try to build between Craven and Elsie, Craven and Elsie, where he is infatuated with her. He is sort of like he sees Elsie's like confidence, and it's like that confidence kind of is a nice how would you say, not makes up it.
Juxtaposition?
Just juxtaposition, yeah. Or it does complement his own timidness. It's like these two opposite, kind of the idea of opposites attract. In Craven's case, Elsie, she seems to be more unaware of Craven's feelings, and I wish that they would have done more with this relationship. Unfortunately, as I would mention maybe later on in this video, in this review, one of the biggest things that hurts this series is that as much as it tries to create a sense of continuity with its world, its setting, its monsters, unfortunately, they don't do the same kind of care on the characters themselves in terms of character progression and character growth. Usually, by the end of these episodes, things kind of revert back to the status quo, and everybody's kind of exactly the same way they were beforehand, only now there's a new monster in the world.
Right. And that was a real quick side note, made almost worse by the fact that Fox would often show episodes out of order. So,
right.
That would throw even more of a kink into things.
Yeah.
But for the rest of the cast, Randy's kind of like you said, the intern, the young guy. He's that kind of 90s all-purpose hacker where he could hack into anything.
Oh, yeah. He's like, I can hack this. The kind of character you would see in Kung Fury, where it's like, back then, if you were a quote-unquote hacker, it means like you can do anything from reprogramming ATM machines to giving you money to hacking the government.
All right. The computer is you're a tool, you're an emergency magician. We're using that, and that's
Right,
what they
right.
have Randy as. I wanted to ask your opinion too on the Monique character and what you thought about her.
Let's see. I did like her. It's kind of like it feels like when you have a team like this, you tend to have the one character who is the loner, the one who is more comfortable being by herself and being alone with her thoughts, and having this character eventually warm up to the team, to the rest of the group, and eventually coming to recognize the character, these her friends as like a legitimate family to her. And it also is very funny how once again we have another like relationship thing going on here, subplot here, with Randy, who is smitten by Monique's kind of like dark femme fatale demeanor,
Right.
and Randy, of course, being the complete opposites, opposites attract. So he's like the goofball, and Monique is just like annoyed with this love smitten jokester. And then again, over the course of the series, they do hint that she is willing to give Randy a chance, especially by the final episode of the movie, where it does feel like, though in the final episode of the series, it does feel like she is willing to to make it a legitimate relationship. But again, it never really progresses forward because everything resets at the end of at the beginning of every episode.
I do kind of like, though, that even though she's a female, they made her like a straight up ass kicker in this series. She's definitely the most physically capable,
Oh, yeah,
and
definitely.
in combat the most capable of them, because she is like a spy, kind of like a La Femme Nikita type character, I guess. Going forward. So that's our cast,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Which is pretty strong, I feel like.
Yeah, and it's also interesting that they created this original character as opposed to relying solely on Philippe, who does actually make an appearance here and there in the series. Usually, he's there to talk directly to Nick or to Monique in private.
Right.
And I guess my theory is they must have replaced Philippe with Monique to balance out the team, to have like an equal amount of male to female characters, or at least like, sure, there's like 3 male characters, 2 female characters, and then you would think, if you think about it, 3 female characters, 4 male characters if you include Nick's girlfriend Audrey and Animal.
Yeah, I wanted to mention that too. They do really, in this series, make Audrey even more not likable than she is in the in the movie, which is tough to do. But she comes across as more of like vicious, as opposed to just incompetent, like she did in the movie.
Yeah, it's kind of funny. Like, they made her better and worse at the same time. Like, better in the fact that she's more of a go-getter. She's more willing to constantly pester Nick into making some sort of arrangement to help help her career, and in return helping Godzilla's public image through the media. But unfortunately, she just comes off as very selfish.
She doesn't. I think they realize that because they really kind of fade her out as the series progresses. She only pops up here and there.
Mm-hmm.
And the dynamic has certainly changed with Nick being more of a confident and forceful person. He's more out to tell her that she's out of line than he was in the film, which was, I guess, kind of nice to see too. So.
And again, like they also have a relationship. There's quite a lot of relationships here, romantic relationships in this series. I just realized. They're constantly bickering. They never seem to get along. They're constantly at odds with one another. And a lot of times Audrey tends to make things worse for the situation, worse for the Heat team, by constantly having her and Animal get in trouble and need saving by the end. And so when it feels like they're ready to, patch things up, the reset button hits. This leads to one of my favorite episodes, which I believe it was called, was it Seeker? Scale. Scale, that was the episode, I believe, where the whole episode takes place on Monster Island through a found footage style
Yes.
format. And so we have Audrey and Animal, they sneak aboard, maybe it was like a Heat boat or military boat, and they end up recording an entire incident that took place solely on Monster Island, where they find out that there's this terrorist organization that is trying to free the monsters in sort of like a PETA for kaiju sort of way. And this ends up causing more trouble for everybody. And by the end, even though Audrey has the chance to skyrocket her career, she decides to burn the footage because she feels like it's much safer to keep Monster Island a secret and to keep these monsters and everyone else safe.
Yeah, and it's real quick about that episode, since you just brought it up. The eco-terrorist characters. This is one thing that this series did really well, was played by Linda Blair, and they were bringing other, like, fairly known names to do the voices for some of their guest characters. Clancy Brown would be a guest character. The great Roddy McDowall, I think this was his last role prior to his death. He would appear in one episode. So just, I think that's kind of cool. Like Batman the Animated Series did that really well with not just bringing in voice actors, but actual actors to do the voices. And this series did that to some extent as well.
Yeah, and they did have some interesting recurring villains here, like Cameron Winter, who was like a rival of Nick's in college, and he has this idea to control Godzilla to make him money. I recall him wanting to make a fake Godzilla, and for a while to frame the real Godzilla. Although it kind of doesn't make sense when you actually get a good look at the fake Godzilla. You're like, how did anyone not just look up and see that it's green?
Right.
And let's see. I did like the last episode where, was it Cameron Winter who was the villain of that one? Or was it someone else entirely who was rounding up monsters and kind of making a gladiatorial combat arena for these monsters? For the sake of the appeasing the like rich folks who tune in to watch the fights.
I think that was somebody else. I don't think that was Cameron Winter.
Okay then, and let's see. I do remember the three redneck hunters. Those were very amusing characters. And let's go ahead.
Some of my favorite episodes are the ones where it was monsters that were kind of almost Lovecraftian in the way that they were approached. Like the first one's that Talk and Trash one, where there's like a nanotech thing that they use to absorb all the trash that's building up in New York City. And it kind of takes on a shape of like the Blob, but more so like one of the Shoggoths.
That was the orange one, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, that was actually sorry to interrupt you. I think that must have been the very first monster the very first episode I had ever seen of the series. So that always stuck with me.
Right, and it was cool because it was a different type of monster than we're used to seeing any version of Godzilla take on, where it doesn't really have any kind of a form, and it's not solid. Like even Hedra had, kind of like a humanoid form at some point, which you don't see that here. Or there was the Juggernaut episode where it was like a piece of technology from a different planet had crashed and just started absorbing all the other technology around it. Again, taking on kind of a Lovecraftian look to it. Was pretty neat. Or the Freak Show episode where they had this Medusa thing, which again, very much not much of a form to it, kind of like the Shoggoths again from Lovecraft. And Godzilla would have to try to fight him. But one thing I noticed too, kind of rewatching this series, is we talked about in the Hanna-Barbera series, how Godzilla is kind of like the big gun in that series, where something goes wrong, Godzilla shows up, takes out the monster, and that's the end of it. In this series, it's not necessarily the case. Godzilla will show up and fight the monster, but a lot of times there's a story involving heat where they have to figure out how to stop the monster as Godzilla kind of keeps him occupied.
Right. And even though he does come into the rescue at many points in the series, he does kind of act of his own accord and only follows very, very basic instructions from Nick himself, where Nick would be like, go there, go away, go hide, go attack. I
actually use that a lot for my Chimera book, a quick plug, but that's similar to what I would do there. So this series did inspire me in that respect.
It's almost like Pokemon. Imagine like Nick versus your main protagonist, Nick versus Luke.
Luke,
Chimera,
go.
Yeah. Chimera, use tackle. Chimera. And I do like that Godzilla is treated as an animal, where he, like I mentioned before, he acts on his own accord, and so there's always this sense of danger and unpredictability to Godzilla. Even though at the end of the day he's not going to kill anyone in this kid show, you always get the feeling that he could potentially do something like that, especially if Nick isn't there.
Right, right. Like you said, treat it like an animal. It's kind of like having a large dog, which is friendly, but can be dangerous. Is kind of how they approach him. I feel like in this
Oh
series.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, yeah. They do treat him like a dog in that case. The
Yeah.
way you mentioned it. Let's see. Thinking of other monsters, the one that I always, one of the few ones that I really liked was I did like the Crackler. I thought that was a very interesting origin for the
Yes.
monster.
Yeah. And the Crackler, it's a electrokinetic beast, and it's kind of when this guy falls asleep, his brain activates it. Correct? Sort of like
Yeah.
a projection from his brain. That one was pretty cool.
Yeah, and the design itself is very imaginative because unlike a lot of the majority of these monsters are just like as we mentioned mutated animals on Earth. So you would get
Right.
like maybe a thorny devil lizard or a Gila monster or an armadillo or a squid or a termite. In fact, now that I think about it, I noticed that there are a lot of almost like half of these monsters are bugs. And so that's probably like the biggest detriment to this series is that they kind of rely too much on bugs. I can understand because bugs, they already look monstrous, so just make them bigger, give them teeth and fangs and spikes, and there you go,
Right.
there's your mutant. I would have liked them to toy around with more animals, like the giant armadillo, or even like the big rhinoceros that was seen at the end of the series.
Yeah. The Crustaceous Rex was pretty good from the pilot. I
Ooh,
felt.
yeah, yeah, that was a very original creation.
Yeah, it almost looked like something from like Stephen King's The Mist, maybe, or Stranger Things. Actually, it kind of reminds me a lot of like a bigger Stranger Things monster to some extent.
Yeah.
So,
Oh, what was really funny is that when upon seeing the Cryptocleidos, I was very shocked to realize that that is essentially a plesiosaur skull crawler.
oh yeah, now that you mentioned it, it really is. I hadn't thought about that
Yeah,
before.
like the face is exactly like the skull crawler. For anyone who doesn't know, just go in and see the Cryptocleidos, and also seeing the Cryptocleidos attacking one of the major cities in the Monster Wars trilogy gave me flashbacks to your sequence of the Loch Ness monster in Operation Rock.
Oh, cool. I would hope so. That's similar to what I was going for. And we do need to talk about the Monster War trilogy, I feel like, when we're talking about this series. Do you think so?
Oh yeah, I do want to bring up one episode beforehand, and
Sure.
that was I think it was a two-parter that featured the Heat team going to the future through
Yes.
some weird electromagnetic mist, and they find that the world is in ruins and humanity is at war with a swarm of these weird insectoid dragon creatures called Dragma, which is an acronym for Democratic Resurgence Against a Global Mechanized Armageddon. And these creatures, we find out that Godzilla died fighting these monsters for the sake of humanity. And so we see a future Craven who is like, all jacked up like any character in a post-apocalypse.
Yeah, he becomes like John Connor, basically. Right?
Yeah, yeah. And he ends up like helping these the team to send the team back in time so that they can prevent let's see, was this a Cameron Winters creation? To stop him from, or no, maybe it was someone else. I keep thinking Cameron Winters in more episodes than he actually is. That just to prevent the creation of these dragon creatures.
No, it was a Jonathan Inslee. It wasn't Cameron Winter in this case.
Okay. But yeah. And as you mentioned before, the most well-known episodes of the series is the Monster Wars trilogy, which was actually quite rare for any animated series to have a three-parter, especially anything that isn't like anime. Like back in the day, we were exposed to anime where all the episodes were connected because it was an ongoing story, and you could never air these episodes out of order. With this sort of television, children's television, it was quite rare to see a three-parter, I think, and so this was the one that stuck out the most to us, especially with its numerous similarities to the well-known, the fan-favorite film Destroy All Monsters.
Right. So the Monsters Wars trilogy is we find out that all of the mutants and monsters, for the most part, Godzilla has taken down. The army has been bringing to an island that they dub Monster Island, kind of like as a nod there. And the gist of it is that in a previous episode with the Cryptocleidos, I believe, the Heat team finds a UFO sort of on the bottom of the ocean. And these aliens are able to control the cryptocollides, and they reappear here and are taking over the monsters. Very similar, again, to Destroy All Monsters, where aliens take over the monsters and use them to attack Earth to weaken its defenses. So it's pretty cool, though. And we also get the very neat resurgence of the Godzilla from the movie as the Cyber Godzilla, where it's more like a cyborg Godzilla, not a straight-up mecha Godzilla.
Right.
And
I did like that. Like, they were able... It's kind of like what Dark Horse did with Cybersaur or Cybersaurus, where it was like,
yes.
have Mechagodzilla without actually having Mechagodzilla.
And what we get to is that Godzilla, that's been the main protagonist for our series, at first looks towards what is his actual mother and starts working with her instead of listening to Nick. But by the time we get to the end, Godzilla turns around and helps Nick and the rest of the Heat team fight off the other monsters and the invading aliens in this instance.
Yeah, that was a very great bit. That was a great bit of character a great character moment for Godzilla Jr. in that case. Let's see. I also realized that a lot of these monsters in a lot of these monsters fights, very rarely does Godzilla actually destroy the monster unless it is like a very inhumanoid creature or non-mammalian, non-lizard-like creature, because for the most part he just like beats these monsters into submission so that they can later make appearances on Monster Island or in another episode.
Right. Although I do have to say, because it was one of the things I mentioned about the Hanna-Barbera series, where I thought that the fights were okay, but not great. They do a pretty good job with the way that Godzilla's fighting the other monsters in this series, I feel like.
Oh, yeah, definitely. And I think the sound design does definitely make these fights come off as more brutal, despite the lack of violence that you would see in like one of your books.
Oh yeah, well, that's a different thing.
It's like looking at reading your books. It's kind of like changed my perception on fights nowadays, where it's like now I'm always imagining like the most like how realistically vicious and bloody a monster fight would go down.
I have a twisted brain. What can I say?
Let's see. Another episode that I remembered was the Robo Yeti episode, where they come across another science team, and they have they come across the Yeti, but it's actually a cyborg, and they kind of have a brief fight with Godzilla, in almost like an homage to King Kong versus Godzilla. And there was even a moment where the Robo Yeti is like playing with a unconscious Godzilla's jaw, much like King Kong.
Right. And again, a nod to King Kong Escapes with the Robo Kong, if you will. And that was one other thing I wanted to say real quick about the fight scenes in this Godzilla from the series is he's not invincible like we see in a lot of other Godzilla incarnations. He's much like the Godzilla 98, susceptible to firearms. He can be kind of beaten up some by other monsters, and he's not like as physically strong as I'm. Maybe strong's not the word, but he's much more agile than the Godzillas we're used to, which they do incorporate well into the fight scenes that they do, where he's moving kind of like in a feline or a serpentine type way, ducking underneath other monsters, coming up beside them, biting, scratching. It just worked well, I thought, for the design in this case.
Right. And I also like the homage that the creator of the Robo Yeti was a person by the name of the woman, female scientist by the name of Dr. Ifukube. Ifukube obviously being an homage to Akira Ifukube, who was the composer for the majority of the Godzilla movies from 1954 to 1995.
Yes, which is just another sign of how we mentioned that Dean Devlin and Roland Emmerich were not in touch with the fan base when they made the Godzilla 98 film. The people behind this, I guess Jeff Kline perhaps, was much more in touch with who Godzilla was and how he should be portrayed.
And I also love this moment in that episode where... the movie was called, the episode was called Competition. I love, there's this moment where Heat and Godzilla are going to Japan, and there's a plane with a Japanese kid who's looking down at Godzilla swimming towards Japan, and he's like, Mommy, look, Godzilla is here. And the mom says, like, oh, that's silly. Why would Godzilla ever be in Japan?
Right, yeah.
Like one of the best, like, ironic, like, wink, wink, nudge, nudge jokes there.
Yeah.
Let's see. There was one more, probably another episode that I wanted to bring up. Let's see. Like the easiest way for me to think of these episodes is just like going through all the monsters down there, one
Right.
by one.
Was it perhaps the episode where they make the love interest for Godzilla?
Yes, that was
Okay.
Komodothrax. That was definitely the one I was thinking of because that
Yeah.
is definitely something we have never seen before in a Godzilla series outside of, ironically, Godzillaland of all places.
Right. Yeah.
Of creating a love interest for Godzilla. And I thought that was a very odd it does feel odd and out there at first, but it was a very interesting concept to explore with a Godzilla who, despite being sterile, does have this need for a family, to produce a family. And it's really weird because from what I understand, reptiles are not exactly the best, do not have like the strongest maternal nor paternal instincts. Maybe like alligators, definitely alligators, I think.
Right.
So I guess I stand corrected, where it's like Godzilla is more, it has the more of that like maternal crocodilian instinct, and it's very strange because, again, now this is another thing I don't know of. I don't know if like there are any reptiles that raise children together, the mother and the father, but this does feel very anthropomorphized for Godzilla, in that he is willing to take this mother Komodothrax, a mutant Komodo dragon, and its baby under his wing.
Yeah. The name of the episode is End of the Line, by the way.
Right, thank you very much. And
Sure.
it is very tragic that the both the baby and the Komodothrax are lost by the end, and so we are left with a Godzilla who is kind of cursed to forever be alone, in terms of like not being able to relate to anyone who is of a similar species to him.
Right. Right. And the threat in this episode is the giant mutant turtle. So it's just kind of another nice Gamera sneak in there.
Right, yeah.
For them. And yeah, it is an odd episode, though. It's not a bad episode, but it doesn't kind of fit in line with the rest of the episodes that we see, or the way that Godzilla is portrayed necessarily. Although it is a neat exploration, like you had said. So
Definitely.
worth noting for anybody who owns a series to check out that episode, at least.
And one thing I do definitely want to mention is that I love the artistic direction for a lot of these monsters. This was made by the same studio that produced Men in Black, the series,
Right.
Extreme Ghostbusters, The Big Guy and Rusty, the Boy Robot. Let's see. I think they also did the Wild Thornberries, as well as the Jumanji TV series, which I don't think anyone has ever has like remembered in years.
No.
The the animation studio is called Adelaide Productions, and Adelaide Productions was an animation division of Sony Pictures Television, and they were making a bunch of TV shows from 1996 all the way as recently as 2009. And as of 2014, this animation company has been dormant, but is still technically listed as active, as according to Wikipedia. So it's kind of interesting looking at this series that has made or took part in the production of numerous television series from the mid 90s to the late 2000s, going so far as doing shows like The Boondocks, The Spectacular Spider-Man, and even that one short-lived Fox series, Sit Down, Shut Up. And then only for them to like completely disappear off the face of the earth. But
Yeah, they did. Spectacular Spider-Man is a great series.
yeah, and but for a lot of their early '90s stuff, especially comparing this show to Men in Black the series and The Big Guy and Rusty, a lot of their monsters are very grotesque looking. They have very bony appearance, bony limbs, a bunch of spikes and spikes and scales and thorns, teeth all over their bodies. They have very skeletal, not so much muscular, more skeletal frames. A lot of gross, wrinkly skin. It's a very unique artistic style that separates Godzilla and these monsters from the rest of the Godzilla franchise. And I think having this sort of like grotesque, almost like, as you mentioned, Lovecraftian
Right.
look to their designs does help distinguish the monsters from each other, with the exception of like the bugs, as I mentioned. They all kind of start to look the same after a while.
Right, right. The kind of commonplace giants don't stand out a ton, but the more unique and creative ones are very unique and creative and stand out from other animated Godzilla series we've seen so far, for sure.
Oh, yeah.
And even live-action Godzilla series.
Yeah, yeah. And I think they all of these monsters really complement the original Godzilla '98 design.
Yeah, they do. They fit well with that Godzilla '98 design. You're absolutely correct.
Mm-hmm. And let's see. And what would you say was your favorite monster from this series?
My favorite monster. If you have to think about it too much, it's not that one. But I would say that the Cretaceous Rex was pretty cool. Although I did like a lot the way that the Loch Ness Monster was portrayed in this series. So those are it's probably between one of those two for me, I'd have to say. What about you?
For some reason, the King Cobra always stuck out to me the most. I think it's pretty much like that webbed frill that he has with those, like, it's almost like he has these spikes, or perhaps they're potentially, like, ribs that are, like, poking out of his, like, how would you call it, that mane of his that all cobras have.
Oh, the hood?
The hood, yeah. He has these like bony spikes coming out of the sides of his hood that I think has this really great outline for him.
I do like that design. I think one of the things that drew me back from that, though, is that was one of the monsters that popped up in Monsters Wars because they showed the episodes out of context or out of
right. So like,
order.
where the hell did he came from?
Right, and then like after Monster Wars, we saw him. So I was like, okay, he's still cool, but yeah, well, what is this guy? I don't remember seeing him. I've seen every episode.
Right. Another one I always liked was El Gusano.
Gusano, yeah, I like the name too for some reason.
Yeah, it's foreign and more sophisticated. Yeah. Also, the thing is, like, for my friend in Shoma, he drew El Gusano and uses him as I think he still uses to this day as his Sky profile picture. So whenever I see El Gusano nowadays, I think back to my friend Raph. And also, I do like the color scheme, like this like sepia tone blue and yellow combination just works very well with the design.
Yeah, no, it's a very good design. Most of these monsters are very well designed.
Yeah, perhaps the freakiest one to me was the DNA mimic, which was this like creature that was sort of like the Thing, John Carpenter's The Thing.
Yes, yeah.
It would take on the appearance of a lot of people, and by the end, it grows very giant, gelatinous gray blob, and takes on the like a humanoid appearance. At which point, it gets really disturbing, seeing Godzilla appear to fight several of the human cast, and it eventually grows into this weird, like, two-headed Elsie.
Yeah, and I always liked that they weren't afraid to do those things, even though this was a kid's show with this series.
Yeah. And, let's see. Which does remind me, going back to one of the few gripes I've had with the series, is that a lot of the times these characters, whenever they get into arguments for the sake of, increasing drama for the series, these characters tend to come off as like children squabbling amongst each other rather than professional adults.
That's definitely true. It's one of the drawbacks to the series is the way that, like you said, the characters are presented with some depth, but they never kind of grow from the depth that they're presented with.
Right, like they start off from a great starting point, but rarely do they move beyond that. A lot of times, like Nick has control issue. How would you guys say, like, control issues, where he needs to be in charge of everything. Everything goes by him. Everything like nothing passes unless it goes through. It checks with him. Like with the whole Wendell Craven and Randy, they're bickering. I do like that. Monique and Randy having this sort of like this little another ongoing feud / subplot is okay, but then when it comes to everybody like squabbling amongst each other, it's like everyone is fighting to shout the loudest at the rest of the characters. And yeah, I think that's where the writing hurts this series the most. Let's see, anything else to discuss about this series? Oh yeah, one little thing that always kind of annoyed me when it came to Nick is that he has tendency of giving the same order 3 times, where he would say go go go, move move move, down down down. It comes off as a bit annoying after a while.
You're right. I hadn't noticed it when I think about it. There's probably him preparing for all those Sharknadoes that were coming his way, because there's multiple sharks, so he's got to call it out a couple times. But yes, yeah, like I said, being is a little annoying in the series. Trying to think what other drawbacks I feel like is presented by this series. Oh, I think, again, this is not the series' fault, but because when this series came out was also the big influx of like Pokemon and Digimon and other things. So when it was being shown, it was constantly being moved around the time slots, which made it difficult to track as well.
And that's what helped, that's what led to the show's cancellation, where, from what I understand, during this time, for those who didn't grow up during the late 90s / early 2000s, there were 2 major channels that were airing Saturday morning cartoons. One was Fox Kids on the Fox channel. The other one was Kids WB. On the WB channel. The WB, they had a partnership with 4Kids Entertainment, I believe. So they had Pokemon on their side. Meanwhile, Fox had Digimon on their side. And both were very, very popular shows about kids who partner up with monsters that can become bigger, more stronger monsters and fight each other. Of course, I'm sure our audience knows what Pokemon is today. But I am curious as to whether or not kids today know what Digimon is, because I often see it pop up here and there at Toys R Us in America, where they would have these seasons that I never even knew existed. I'm surprised Digimon is still a thing in Japan. Meanwhile, in America, I always felt like Digimon dropped off after season 3 or 4, because I dropped off after season 3.
Yeah, definitely. My kids have no idea what Digimon is. We've seen comics and stuff, and I've had to explain to them well, it's kind of like Pokemon, but more in a digital world, and the monsters might have been a little bit more scarier compared to I guess the season 1, 2, and 3 Pokemons, where they're more cutesy.
That is very true. Yeah, the Digimon designs were always much more muscular, from what I remember.
Right. Yeah. But both shows were hugely popular at this time frame, which didn't help out Godzilla the series, unfortunately.
Right, because Fox was willing to cancel the series in order to make more room for Digimon, so they could have an hour of back-to-back episodes of Digimon to attract more kids to their side.
Right.
And yeah, that's unfortunately what led to the cancellation. I could be wrong, though. There could be more. I know there was an article on Sci-Fi Japan that has a major list of interesting facts and trivias on the history of the production of the of Godzilla the series, and I highly recommend anyone to check that out. And for the longest time, the series was unavailable outside of 2 DVDs, one featuring a couple of episodes and another one featuring the Monster Wars trilogy. And it wasn't until recently, around the release of the 2014 movie, did Sony and TriStar actually release the entire series in a complete DVD collection. So it should be relatively easy to get a hold of that release if you ever want to check out the series, which I do highly recommend in the end. Let's see, anything else before we go into final thoughts?
I don't think so. I think we've covered most things about this series, so I think it'd be final thought time. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, I feel like this was a huge improvement in comparison to the Hanna-Barbera Godzilla series. Although it feels like this was a movie. I keep going back to that. I feel like this was a TV series that was making strides to create a more coherent story that could grow and develop over the course of the series. Unfortunately, even though there were a lot of shows that were progressing towards having more serialized storytelling, they were still being. I felt like this show was still being restricted by the old style of making TV shows, where you can have to follow a formula so that you can make air these episodes in syndication out of order. So in a way, it's almost reaching that halfway point where it's so close to being a great, memorable, deep series, but it's kind of bogged down by the standards at the time.
Right. Real quick, I think what you're saying here too, and I feel the same way, is that there's no real central villain that's overarching. Cameron Winter pops up here and there, but it's more just monster of the week type of thing.
And they do have like the Leviathan aliens, but I think they disappeared pretty much after Monster Wars.
Exactly right. I think they had the one episode that kind of introduced them. Then they were the overarching villain in Monster Wars, and then that was it. There was no kind of big threat in the back that had to be dealt with from start to finish.
Right. And even though, like, at the end of the Monster Wars trilogy, Nick hints that they may come back. It's like this might be the beginning of something bigger, even though we never get to see it.
Right.
Yeah, and again, I feel like this was like much like Hanna-Barbera Godzilla. I feel like this premise with these characters, this has the potential to be fleshed out more in like a IDW comic or something. But I doubt that'll ever happen.
Right.
Like, I kind of want to see like what Boom Studios did with the Power Rangers, where they kind of reinterpret the Power Rangers, like kind of like basically how they were from the TV show, but with like more decent, fleshed out writing. I wish they can get both of these American shows could get the same treatment. But in the end, I feel like the Godzilla series is a very decent series, very well executed for the most part. Memorable characters, interesting monsters, great fights, and a overall solid presentation. So I'm going to give Godzilla the series a solid 3 out of 5. Definitely check it out if you're a Godzilla fan or a fan of monsters and action shows.
Yeah, and I concur with you. I think 3 out of 5 is a good rating for this, especially when you consider what it was coming from. We talked briefly in the beginning about it, but a movie that was really disliked for this to get the following that it currently has, or the respect that it looks back with now, really says a lot about the series.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And even to this day, it does stand out as a really decent action show, because nowadays I think it would be very rare to have an action show with like this level of detail on your characters. Like the characters, they have a very anatomically accurate feel to them. Like, none of the characters are really all that exaggerated. From a design perspective, the monsters, they have a ton of detail, so I'm sure it must have been a lot of hard work to animate these detailed monsters and keep them on model. This is something that I don't think you would really see nowadays, because it seemed like everybody is going for a more simplistic art style to make things easier to animate, to have more fluid animation. Here we do have our fluid animation with bits of choppiness here and there, but overall it's quite a technical marvel for the 80s. I mean 80s for the 90s.
I was going to say, to give a comparison, compare this series to the Kong Atlantis series that came out around the same time. And this series is far superior in terms of animation, storytelling, you name it. Wouldn't you agree?
It's been years since I've seen the Kong animated series. Only recently have I seen the 2 movies that they made years after the show was canceled. But yeah, I would say from what small memory I have, for what little I can remember of the show, yeah, I do remember this is a much more ambitious series, both on a narrative and artistic and technical scale.
Yeah, I totally agree. So again, I'm with you. I say if for whatever reason fans haven't seen this series, it's definitely worth checking out. I think you can find it on YouTube too without too much difficulty, just to kind of stream it. So.
Oh yeah, absolutely. There were bootlegs of it, but at this point I don't think it's really necessary at all, because now it's officially available on DVD in its entirety. So those have been our thoughts on the follow-up to the infamous 98 film, Godzilla the series. We hope you've enjoyed that. And so what are we going to be looking at next time, dear Matt?
Next time we'll be looking at a Shin-Chan episode. I believe it's episode 901 that featured Shin Godzilla in it, along with the title character. So Absolutely. We look forward to seeing you guys then.
A lot of, again, the Japanese are always, going against everyone, the Westerners' expectations when it comes to Godzilla and anime. It's like, we want a Godzilla anime. Here you go. It's an educational children's show. We want a Godzilla crossing over with a famous anime character. Like maybe Gundam or Voltron or Dragon Ball Z.
Take your pick of any one that would work. Yeah.
Okay. Shin-Chan. What? But as we get into the review for next time, you'll see why this was quite a big deal for Godzilla. So, I have been Andres Perez, aka Kaiju Noir.
I've been Matthew Denyon.
And until next time, everybody, Take care.